We have our research panel up here. It's the next part of our agenda. For those of us that are in the room, if you guys want to learn more about anybody who's speaking today, we have that bio sheet, so that kind of gives your like cheat sheet for remembering what everybody does. It has their photos on it, so you can use that. And for those online, again, it's on the website if you want to learn a little bit more. Okay, so this is a really big panel, 7 people, and they're researchers, and I know they're passionate. So we're going to see how this goes. Okay, so we have the microphone, and I want to just start with you guys maybe introducing yourselves, just a brief name, affiliation, and what you guys work on, and then we'll start with some questions. Okay, who wants to go first? The microphone's in the middle. Okay, good, Marcus, go.
Good morning, my name is Marcus Sutella. I'm at Florida State University. I'm a coastal ecologist, sedimentologist. My personal hobby is sand, and when the oil came to shore, most of my study sites were covered with oil, so overnight I turned into somebody who worked with oil. We did a long-term study at Pensacola Beach, and if there's time, I can report on what we found.
Hello, I'm Sabrina Barra. I'm a American Society for Engineering Education postdoc at the U.S. Naval Research Lab, and my research focuses on circulation in the shelf and looking at the interactions between fresh water from the rivers and the shelf saltier water and how they mix and interact.
My name is Stephen Allen. I'm with the University of Southern Mississippi, and I'm a physical oceanographer and hydrographer. And one of the things I do that's pertinent to this topic is operate radars for measuring surface currents offshore.
Hi, I'm Greg Jacobs with the Naval Research Laboratory. I'm feeling overdressed today. The work we do is the research and development of forecast systems in the physical ocean environment, so the currents throughout the water column, temperature and salinity, and we transition those to the operational people who use those and make forecasts of the ocean on a daily basis.
I'm Steve Morey with Florida State University Center for Ocean Atmospheric Prediction Studies. I'm a physical oceanographer. I study primarily circulation and physical processes focused on the Gulf of Mexico. And I deal with physical processes from all the way from thousands of meters of deep, the interaction with currents and with imagery, pertinent to where deep plumes would have gone, all the way up to the very surface layer, a few centimeters deep. And so when the oil spill happened, I became an oil spill model. And I'm also focused now on coupling modeling tools of oil transport with biogeochemical models and sediment models and some other types like that to study the whole Earth system, if you will.
Hi, my name is Ryan Rogers. I'm at the National High Magnetic Field Laboratory at Florida State University. I'm a classically trained analytical chemist, mass spectrometrist. I've been working in petroleum science for about 2 decades. What we're trying to do is bring molecular management to the understanding of oil spills, identifying the molecular level composition of these contaminants, and then knowing their reaction mechanisms to predict what's going to be formed in the environment and the toxicity.
My name is Frank Hernandez. I'm an assistant professor at University of Southern Mississippi. My research interests are in fisheries ecology, specifically the early life stages, so fish eggs, larvae, and their juveniles. Because the eggs and larvae are primarily planktonic or pelagic, makes me a bit of a biological oceanographer too, so we're also interested in zooplankton and trophic food webs and all the biological and physical factors that affect local fish survival, which eventually leads to recruitment to fisheries.
Okay, awesome. So, I have a few questions in my back pocket, but do you guys have any questions right off the bat, just kind of hearing what everybody focuses on? Okay, I'm gonna start with mine. Okay, we've finished the panel in the wetland seminar with this one. Okay, so I wanted each of you to talk about one myth that maybe your research helped prove wasn't true, or, don't worry, that's only one option, or talk about something that you have been working on or plan to work on that relates to oil spill response. So something to improve response in these nearshore habitats. So maybe just, telling us a little bit more about some of the stuff that you guys have been doing. Anybody want to go first? Okay, pass that mic over.
So this is one that's been actually bothering me since 2010. And I'll put it in the category of a myth. So I'm a fisherman, and in the summer after the oil spill, I took my family and we went fishing in Franklin County, Florida, the boat ramp I typically use. And as I got to my boat ramp, it was barricaded off, and I was shocked to see responders had set up a village there, and I talked to the man who was managing this, and they were laying miles and miles of boom. I said, there's not going to be any oil here in Franklin County, Florida. I would have bet the farm on it had I owned a farm. Nobody asked me. I had done a lot of work on circulation in the Gulf of Mexico, particularly in the northeastern Gulf of Mexico. Franklin County is to the east of Apalachicola. It encompasses Apalachicola Bay and St. George Sound. It's an environmentally, ecologically sensitive area. But there was zero chance of the oil getting there during that season in particular from where the oil was at the time. But there was a lot of, I believe, political pressure from Franklin County to get boom there. And I think some of this may stem from the fact that Franklin County was undergoing actually was still in the housing recession, if you will. This village ended up filling up a huge bank-owned condominium property, as well as setting up camp, brought probably hundreds of people to the small town of Caramel, and that was more than an economic flip for that county. But there were definitely people who were so concerned with what was being presented in the media, they were convinced oil was going to come in and get into the bay and cause harm. They had to move. Well, I eventually found another boat ramp, went out fishing, and went around miles of boom around these inlets. There were studies that had been out there on the circulation of the area, and there's no scientific study, no model would have shown really any significant chance at all of surface transport from where the oil was into the oyster bay. Another consequence that happened due to this myth that oil could get into the bay was that the governor actually relaxed restrictions on harvesting of oysters. And the oystermen and oyster harvesters went crazy, bringing in all the oysters they can, and the oyster industry collapsed because there were some awesome environmental conditions that prevented growth of the oyster since then. So yeah, these were myths, I believe, that was out there about if there's oil, it must going to be impacting our area without really bringing in information from the science. And so I don't know if we've addressed that issue since or not. I suspect probably not.
Well, and so maybe that's a good follow-up, and we can get back to the myths and what you guys are all working on. But does anybody have a follow-up? Because I know a lot of you are looking at nearshore current modeling, so how, what you see with the research you guys are doing, and also maybe any efforts that you've had to kind of incorporate that into response activities.
I'll follow up a little bit on what Steve brought up there. If we look back at the Deepwater Horizon, that was an enormous event, far larger than some of the really interesting examples Jackie has shown, where there's oil on the beach, there it is, let's go clean it up. An event like the Deepwater Horizon is unique up to now, thank God. But it involved a lot of people coming forward to address the problem and had to be done in a coordinated way. So were we prepared as a nation to address something of that size at the time? Yes, no, Steve just pointed that out. And so the question is, okay, after the amount of time has gone by, are we better equipped now? Steve's answer is no, and I would agree with that. So there's been an enormous amount of work. We've learned a lot about what goes on in the coastal areas from all the observations. We realize what needs to be incorporated in the models in terms to be able to predict that. So we have a better technical capability to address these kinds of problems in the future. But are we taking that forward and getting it to the people who have the responsibility when something like this happens? They're supposed to be responsible for making those predictions. so badly know where to put the food. So I don't think we've gotten to that point, so there's a big step that still needs to be made to take all this knowledge that's been developed through Gomery and bring it forward so it's ready for the next big event, or even small events.
And so that's one, I'll just mention that that's one of the things that we wanted, one of the reasons we're having the panel and some of these seminars. So I think that's a great point. And is there anything that any of you guys want to follow up on with something that, something really interesting or useful that you found that you really think could help response efforts in the future? So it might be some looking at currents, how those move around. Oh, you want to pass it down?
So I think what we found is, in this idea of molecular management, is that classical oil spill techniques kept track of what went into the environment and then what went away. And those are classic GC or gas chromatography methods. What we found is that there is advanced analytical technology that's been used in the oil industry for now 20 years that can track what the molecules spilled in the environment turn into. And that's what we're now able to do. And so I think these transformation products and the ability to understand how the oil is changing, they may have identified maybe 100 or 200 by classical methods. Using advanced analytical methods in 2 analyses, we identified about 70,000. So I think analytical methodologies are advancing very quickly. And so what I would love to see is a sit down between the beat community as a whole and look at Gomery and say, what can we take away from this huge pulse of money into this field and craft deliverables for responders. And that's, I think, what I would like to see done.
Any other things you guys have learned that you think would be very useful for response? Yeah, Marcus, I knew you had something.
Yeah, we learned something. What was impressive to me, it's not really a myth, but you can read a lot about oil degradation in sediments, and there's abundant literature about that. And so we thought when we went into the field and we saw the damage and we saw all the oil in the field, we thought, well, there's some very good understanding, this will stay with us, and we'll have to deal with the cleanup efforts and remove the stuff. And then we were surprised what we saw. We took some of the sediments from the beach in the lab, of course, to do detailed analysis, and we're sitting on the shelf and looking at it, and it would not change. It would just be very steady, and that was in sharp contrast to what we observed in the field. So in the field, we saw pretty rapid changes that would not affect so much the thick tar layers and the tar balls that were surface residual balls that were mentioned, but it affected the smaller particles and the stain that you would see everywhere. It was mentioned before that the oil was pretty much buried into the sediment down to a couple of feet, even more, and you would see that the sand was not white anymore, but brownish in color and so forth, and that disappeared very quickly. And so that was something that we learned, that we have a lot of processes that we cannot really reproduce in the lab so easily, that are very active out in the field and affecting these oil degradation processes tremendously. And one thing that we learned and that we have underestimated is what the ocean can do for the oil degradation in the beach. And what the ocean does is it changes the groundwater level in the beach. These are very porous sediments, very, very permeable. So when the tide changes, the water level in the beach goes up and down. And what that does, it's tremendously important for the oil that you have oxygen. We all know that. It's tremendously important that we have moisture. It's very important that we have nutrients. What this pumping by the tides does is that it brings in warm temperatures and oxygen into the beach and pumps CO2 out, the degradation product from the oil, and brings in moisture from the deeper layers that have been wetted during the previous tides. What it also does, it allows through this wetting process that nutrients that are in the seawater get into oil sediment layers. So when you add this tidal pumping to the oil degradation of buried oil in the beach, and we reproduce that in the lab, then you see a very rapid decline of the oil. When you don't have that, you will see that the oil degrades very, very slowly, because then a lot of these anaerobic processes take place, because there's no access to oxygen. And so ask, what would we do in the future if something like that would happen again? We would try to have as much oxygen in the beach as possible. And that is possible by removing the surface oil that is like a blanket on the sand that prevents this breathing. Because when you look at it from a little bit of a distance, this beach appears like basically a warm-blooded breathing animal. The sand has a very large surface area that accumulates all the oil. The sand attracts oil, basically. It can be used to bind oil. And so all the sand grains were covered by a thin layer of oil, and that stained these sands. So you have oil on a very large surface area, and that allows microbes to degrade it very effectively. And so when you have this breathing of oxygen into the beach and CO2 out of the beach, and getting moisture in and out, and nutrients in and out, and the warm temperatures in the Gulf, you have a perfect scenario to degrade that oil. You don't want to disturb that scenario. When you drive a heavy vehicle over the beach, you compact the sand, the oiled sand, and you reduce the permeability. You reduce this breathing effect. One important thing is that you remove thick layers of oil also within the sediment that can prevent the oxygen exchange. But other than that, nature has provided very effective tools to degrade this oil in the beach. So we have to, as always, balance the damage that we do with all the equipment that we drive onto the beach and what we can achieve. And so a comparison between beaches that have been treated and beaches that have not been treated would provide a lot of answers.
Put your picture up there. I still laugh. What did you give you credit?
Yeah, that's one of our trenches where we
You can see it. Okay, so I'm going to write that down for one of the studies. So comparing areas that have been oiled.
Can I add that real quick?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So I love this picture, and I worked with Marcus on this.
So what you're seeing is the primary layer that gets oiled and then subsequently buried. You basically have geochromatography going on. So it's chromatographic separation and it's silica substrate. And so what you see bleeding down are the water solubles as the water gets pumped in and out of the beach with a tidal cycle. And so as these things are degraded and oxygenated, their water solubility increases, and so they're actually migrating as if they're on a thin layer chromatography plate or something, if you've ever seen one developed. And so this bleeding down is directly related to the oxidation and the increased water solubility. So as water comes in and comes back out, they bleed down in the sand. And that increases the surface area and gives this beautiful substrate for the biodegradation to occur. And so it was a really nice set of samples that we got from Marcus to look at.
Other things that everyone wants to add? Other information?
Well, you made me follow up on this.
That's why.
So I'm going to talk about some advances in oil spill modeling. By this I mean oil spill forecast modeling or scenario planning type modeling. So traditionally, a lot of the modeling is focused on modeling where the surface oil goes, that which is visible on the surface. During the oil spill, we got into understanding the dissolved constituents and where it went subsurface in the oil. But the impacts that we're talking about here at the beach still related to surface oil transport. And basically, the problem involves understanding how oil moves under different current, wind, and wave conditions, and also how the oil disappears through weathering, biodegradation, sedimentation, and other processes, as well as human activities, burning, skimming, etc. And there were quite a few advances made on this through the oil spill during the time since the BP oil spill. And a lot of this is because we got a lot of data and a lot of observations during this oil spill. There's been a lot of studies. So one of the most striking things that we were able to figure out is how quickly the oil on the surface actually did go away. And this came about through work with our collaborators that analyze satellite data, synthetic aperture radar, and some other tools that can be used to understand and actually map the coverage of oil. We haven't had the opportunity to do that in previous oil spills. The scientific community hasn't had the tools. We got excellent satellite data. So now having this database that we can compare different types of oil spill models to, we're able to understand some very basic things. During the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, it turns out that the oil existed on the surface with a half-life of about 5 to 7 days. And during this spill, this wasn't really understood. And that's a fairly short amount of time. I mean, big spills in the past, the Exxon Valdez, happened in a very different environment, a very different type of oil that has different characteristics on how to go away, evaporate, etc. During the spill, though, there was a very well-publicized model result that came from the National Lab, and if you do an internet search, you'll find it. And it showed an animation that was all over CNN and everything, of oil moving down the loop current, impacting the Florida Keys, the southeast Florida coast, and all the way across the Gulf Stream and hitting the UK. And this probably wasn't going to happen. It wasn't going to happen for this particular spill. Nevertheless, there was a lot of concern about oil beaching in the Keys, and outside of a couple isolated old weather tar balls that may have floated up in the region, there was no significant impact down there. But this was one of the things that we really learned is that in different environmental conditions, we can now have modeling tools that can better forecast how long the oil will stay on the surface. Now, one of the big questions that we have that we probably can address now is how this will change for a large spill like this that happens perhaps during a different season. Colder oceanographic conditions slow down a lot of the things that cause oil to go away off the surface. Fortunately, this happened during the warm season. That's fortunately. Otherwise, the beaching of oil could have been much, much more severe, as well as the wind patterns change. So we now have tools in our possession that we can use to look at different scenarios like this that can help in planning any unfortunate future spills.
Following on to that, I think that example of the oil going to England was based on our concept of how the oil was going to evolve and transport at that time. We thought the oil would be carried by these large currents, and this is where we expect the currents to take them. If you look at actual pictures you see on the web of what the actual oil distribution looked like, it wasn't just this smooth, uniform layer of oil out there. No, there's all these structures that formed on the surface, fractal patterns. You can see the oil getting denser and denser and thicker up to a line, and then nothing. So there's things going on in the ocean that holds this oil together. Those are things that we didn't really understand or know were in the ocean and affecting things. And since then, there have been nice experiments where people put drifters over a 10 square mile area, and in the order of a couple days, all those drifters got sucked into an area about a few hundred feet square. So there's these things going on in the ocean that pull all this surface material put together. That's something that we didn't know, that the process that people followed going out trying to clean up this oil didn't know this was happening. So here's something you can exploit. If I know that oil is going to get pulled together and be concentrated, now I can take a ship, spray dispersants, however I intend to address it. But I can be a whole lot more efficient in the dollars that I'm spending for that ship time for dispersants. I can get a whole lot bigger bang for the buck because of what we know what's going on now with how the ocean really evolves the oil on the surface.
Larissa, we have an online question. Just whenever you're ready.
Okay, let's just quickly, before we take that online question or anybody, any other questions, Frank and Sabrina, do you guys want to talk about some of the work that you guys do with Concord? maybe?
Yes, so as I mentioned before, I study how fresh water from the rivers interacts with the shelf seawater. And to answer her question from before, one of the myths that pertain to my research is that when the oil spill happened in the Mississippi River, they opened a lot of the channels, what are they called? The diversions of the river to kind of create this freshwater layer that would, in their minds, protect the coastal areas, because generally, with the previous oil spills, they're more of a surface oil that you can corral, I guess, with the booms and everything, and it was expected that the fresh water would also act as kind of a barrier. But with this deep oil spill where there was a lot of under the surface transport, it seemed like creating these more complicated circulation patterns by adding fresh water on the surface and having salt water below actually might have brought in oil into areas that maybe they wouldn't have expected as much oil or any oil. So that's one of the myths that I think was kind of debunked by this oil spill and by our research.
So again, I work with larval fish primarily, and they're in the water column. And I'll just reiterate a couple of points that have come up from some of the other speakers. Is one, it's hard to replicate some of the things from the lab, and when you go out in the field, you see something very different. So from a early life history perspective, there have been a lot of nice work where researchers have taken larval fish in the lab, and they're exposing them to different levels of toxicity. And you may have seen these studies where they have, primarily you see these cardiac dysfunctions. So bluefin tuna, mahi-mahi, red drum most recently. And so you think, all right, these things are exposed to these oil, they're larvae, they're floating, they have no control, and they get aggregated by the same processes everyone's talking about, and so it's doom and gloom. As an ecologist, when we go out in the field, we don't see that. The fish assemblages seem to be fairly resilient. So one of the more interesting things that's come out of the Garmin research, and you go to the meetings and you'll see this, is anyone working in a lab with larval fish or early life fishery stages, they can definitely see impacts of this spill. But from a population level, those of us that are out in the field, we don't see that. So there is some disconnect in the science there that's really interesting. Why these individual effects aren't scaling up to a population effect? A lot of it has to do with, again, someone mentioned that how very different this spill is from Valdez. It's a very big open system. Again, these fish spawn in the water column. Their larvae are transported by currents. So there's a lot of supply out there to sort of reestablish fish populations. So I think that's one thing. Specifically with Concord, and this, I think someone else mentioned this about, this oil spill didn't happen in a vacuum. So the hardest thing from an ecologist, we have so much, I just call it noise in the system. There's so much variability in everything we're studying from these animal populations that it's really difficult to assign any sort of change to something you would say would be directly related to the oil spill. And so one example from our work is that we had a time series of red snapper larvae, and we wanted to look at their condition and diet and growth sort of from our periods before the spill, during, and after. And what we did see some differences. They seemed to have, for example, during the spill and the following year, they were in generally poor condition. But that condition ended up, in our analysis, mostly related to river discharge. So under higher river discharge scenarios, the red snapper seemed to be doing they were in generally poorer condition. And so why that is, that's what we're looking at now, and that's sort of a Concord-related question. But it just sort of goes to show you that, there was all these other things going on. What are the climatic things? Is it an El Nino year or not an El Nino year? What's the river discharge? What else is going on in the system that there's so many reasons why we can see impacts. And so the real challenge, I think, is to, at least for the biological point of view, is how do you tease apart any oil spill impact from just the noise that's out there?
I had written that down. Ask how loud differs from few. So, good, thanks. Thanks, Frank. So what about any questions from any of you? Now you guys have to have some questions. You've heard all about what they do. Okay, we're gonna test time. We're gonna use this. We have to introduce yourself.
James has Oakland Golf. I just wanted to address some of you were talking about some of the things that happened during this spill. I can kind of tell you some of the background
That's
information. Because you probably didn't know that. Actually, the governor and the person that was the head of coastal restoration during the oil spill actually made the decision to open up those floodgates. And not only did it do what you said it did, it also killed all the oysters that were in that particular area. So that was something that just so you just have that in your back pocket. This thing with the loop current, I worked for Admiral Landry during the spill, and when that came up, at that point in time, and Charlie's not here right now, but no one was concerned about this, and all the trajectory modeling and everything that we saw looked to see, from our perspective, it was just going to stay in the Gulf of Mexico. We never thought it would ever leave the Gulf of Mexico and go other places. We used to have these local calls. We'd have local individuals calling in from the East Coast all the way to the other end of Texas, and we'd call the locals call, and they would call and they would ask us questions. Well, we had a person from Delaware call and said, "Hey, is this oil going to hit our beaches in Delaware?" And from what I saw, from the information that I saw at that particular point in time, no, I don't think there's any chance that it will ever reach the Keys of Florida, more or less, Delaware. So I'm glad that you did do that study, because in the future that will come up again, and that's great that you do that. And hopefully the studies and stuff that you've done that gets fed into NOAA when they do their trajectory modeling, and that help us in the future. The same with subsea dispersants. And when we were using subsea dispersants, we didn't know what was going to happen with the oil after we sprayed it. We knew that there was going to be some effect. We didn't know what it was, so it was kind of an experiment as we went along. And a lot of that, the same information proved out. I think Jackie got some information too. But we saw that it went up to about 1,500 meter level, and then just kind of stayed in that thermal climb or whatever that was, and it just kind of fed its way out. But we were talking about parts per billion. In the press, it was a plume, and I loved she did a talk somewhere, and she talked about what did the plume actually look like, and well, you can even see it was no plume. And I used to call it the clear lens, because it wasn't a plume at that point in time, because the oil had basically degraded beyond anything that you could actually see. So, and the Gulf of Mexico is really resilient. I think we've seen that over the course of the last 7 years. We appreciate all your research. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Okay, other questions from the audience? Oh, please. Use the microphone here. Don't forget to introduce yourself.
Thank you. Hi, Lee Yokel. I work at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab for the Gulf of Mexico Alliance. And I'm wondering, as you all are modeling programs, are you thinking about looking for like a public, kind of like a sea level rise viewer, but more like a trajectory modeling thing that the public can play with in the future, so that they can, it's like, we throw out marine debris and we track it. We're tracking sharks. Is there anything that you all might consider that the public would be able to do? And then my second question is, what do you think the public's tolerance is to natural degradation time? Because it sounds like that's a really interesting approach to follow through with. How long do you think they would be able to deal with waiting for it to break down and understanding that?
Well, I was part of the Gulf-funded Deep Sea Consortium. One of our collaborators was the Norwegian Met Office, as well as a Norwegian private group called Syntec, does a lot of oil spill modeling. And they did actually develop a web-based online oil spill tracking tool that could be used by technically literate people, but non-scientists. And I believe there's probably others out there, but I know that that one particularly exists.
No, it hasn't. No.
No, but yeah, but you
No.
have, it's not, you have to kind of.
It's not,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's not immediate.
not very different.
So your question of what can be made available to the public for these things, it's very straightforward to make those kinds of things. The problem is, going back to the example where we were about to have oil all over England, is an event like the Deepwater Horizon, everybody got very excited, wanted with good intentions to help address the problem. So there's an enormous number of people suddenly putting out all kinds of things, and it turns into chaos. NOAA has some very good people whose job it is to figure out how do we craft this message properly for the public so we don't panic people, and yet they pay attention to it so they take the appropriate action. That's a really hard problem. And those are the kind of people we really need to entrain when we start asking, what's the right kind of information we want to make available to the public? What's the right information we want to make available to the decision responders? So there's always this vast range of things that we all can do and can easily be misinterpreted if we don't carefully think about exactly what we're going to tell people. That's an important part of the problem.
Yeah, so to go along with that, for example, the online tracking tool, they said, could be used by anybody. But I think it's nearly impossible for someone who's not trained to use it correctly. Because there's so many parameters that someone would have to input in order to get a proper simulation. In particular, data about composition of the oil. That is one of the biggest contributors that this group Syntaf gave, is they're probably the world's leading group in databases of different types of oil and how it behaves. And if you get that wrong, you simulate oil going to England. And if you get it right, you get oil staying in the Gulf and not impacting east of Apalachicola, not getting to the Keys. And that just requires knowledge that only specialists have. So how to digest and that kind of technical information, put it out to the public now, as Greg has mentioned, probably becomes the issue.
I can give you an example of how that happened. It speaks directly to your point. During the spill, we actually put out information. We put out the trajectory information on the spill. Well, unfortunately, most of the spill trajectory that was actually mapped during that period of time was actual sheen or false positives. So it made it look like the spill was much larger than it actually was, and didn't give any thickness. So a lot of fisheries were closed based on that information, just to be conservative, and that's where the public and the private interface happened. It was like, well, we want to be more conservative than not, so we're just going to close the fisheries based on that trajectory. The other problem with the trajectories were they're only good for 36 hours, and we were putting out 40 forecasts. So that was a problem because we didn't know what it was going to do in 4 days. We only knew in 36 hours, pretty much just like a weather person. So that was an issue too. So as far as what did we put out, what we don't put out, if we don't put it out, and we haven't, somebody has a problem with it because it should be public information anyway. But the problem is consumers or the public's going to consume it, and it's not going to be correct, and they're going to make assumptions based on bad information.
I'll just add to that, similar to the hurricane models, you'll see different tracks. A lot of the hurricane models they'll produce very similar sort of runs, but the tracks are vary from kind of a mean value, and for various reasons, different models will produce different trajectories. So if you're worried about a particular spot, it really matters where features are in the model. So both models may have the same feature, but they might be offset by a certain distance, which will affect the trajectory. And so one of the issues in the Gulf of Mexico is that we don't really have the observing system that we need that help inform the models and inform the people analyzing the models. And for instance, the west coast of the U.S., the northeast coast, is well covered with coastal radars for surface currents. In the Gulf of Mexico, the whole Louisiana coast is not covered. So we've got all these platforms out there, and we have no radar stations for measuring what the actual currents are doing in that region. And unfortunately, even with all the money, the restoration money, the observing system in the Gulf of Mexico is not being built out to where it really needs to be.
Well, it has been mentioned already, but I'd like to emphasize one more time. When you look at the local weather forecast, you would not trust it probably beyond 3 or 4 days. So if you give a modeling tool to somebody who is very much interested in whether the oil is going to affect my local area, then of course that person may be tempted to go beyond that time frame and draw conclusions from that, and that will not work. So putting out these models for the public to use may cause more confusion than it may help. Also because the oil is transported differently from ocean currents, as it smooths the surface, and so the wind effect is different, the wave can affect it. So as soon as the weather changes, you will also see change in that movement, and so like forecasting the weather, you have to take the same caution in interpreting these model trends.
So a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, and to add to that about the composition dependence, the oil composition dependence. So CENTEP does have good composition models, but it also depends on where the spill occurs, right? So the Gulf of Mexico basically photooxidized, we now know photooxidized the crude pretty extensively. And that produces oxygenated versions of hydrocarbons, which are surfactants. And so you saw these mousses and other things that they were scooping up, these reddish brown mats. That's due to oxidation of around 1% of the crude. So it's a 1% compositional change, changes the viscosity by like 2 orders of magnitude. And the modelers have known this for years because they talk about aging effects. Well, we now know it's due to photooxidation, and it's producing naturally occurring surfactants, which are swelling the oil with water, which drastically change its viscosity. So I think we're getting to a point now where we can start to congeal a lot of this information and get it into the models, both on a molecular and bulk characterization scale to help all these efforts.
So Lee, in answer to your first question, it does not exist. But they have lots of ideas on how to do that. That was great. And so what about, so the second part of Lee's question was kind of talking about, you know, how oil can break down over time and kind of how patient we think people might be waiting for that to happen. Anybody? And we can also ask this later in the day too when we're looking at those case studies, because you know, our other speakers might have some ideas on that.
Well, I mean, so I agree with you 100%. As a scientist, when you start talking about heavily impacted areas and everything else, as far as the Earth is concerned, it's not contaminated, right? Because I mean, it can wait 10,000 years and it'll all be gone. What makes it inconvenient is because we want to use it or make use of the property that's contaminated. So I think as a scientist, as we start to understand, you know, the composition of the oil and Marcus's work on how it affects physical properties and local microbiological environments, that we're definitely on the right path to come up with better strategies to, I mean, not go in and clean, right, but just to nudge nature in the right direction so it can get it done on a convenient time scale for us.
Any other questions?
Mary has one. Is this from you or online?
It's from me.
Oh, good.
So in 2010, I'm the communicator for Sea Grant now, but I don't have a scientific background. And in 2010, I was a freelance writer living in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, waiting for the oil to wash ashore. I would go out with my kids and we would think this is the last time we're going to get to swim before it all washes ashore. And it was my understanding later on that what saved a lot of the Mississippi coast was the barrier islands and also outflow from the Mississippi River. And my question as a non-scientist, did the scientists who work as physical oceanographers expect the oil to go further east and hit Alabama and Florida harder than it did Mississippi, which is much closer physically to the actual spill? And if they did not expect it, how much now does studying about outflow factor into responders' decisions, freshwater outflow?
Uh-oh. Was it that good of a question? No one wants to take it.
What did we expect to have happen?
Well, I am the river and freshwater person here, but I'm not too familiar with what was expected at the time. I was not even in grad school back then. So I don't know how useful I'll be in answering that question, but I think it just depends on how good the models were at predicting how the currents were moving, and like they were talking about before, we didn't really know a lot of the intricate details that really would determine where the oil was going to go. I think our understanding was more on the big picture kind of thing. And
Well, we were told it was coming, just brace yourselves, it's coming, and it never came.
4-day trajectory was
Yeah.
anyone?
Well, and it really depends on what type of weather events are, occur during that time frame. If we have strong southeasterly winds, it could force more water into some of the passes or not. There was a study done for Concord analyzing an event where there were strong southeasterlies that kept water in Mobile Bay. A lot of the Mobile Bay outflow went into the Sound and out some of the western passes. And there was more inflow into some of the eastern passes. So it really depends on, what kind of discharge is occurring. Because Mobile Bay itself has, the fourth or fifth largest discharge in North America. So it's substantial freshwater there. So, what are the discharge rates for the various rivers? What kind of wind forcing is occurring at the time?
Anybody else know?
Well, going along with that, there's a striking seasonal variability of particularly the wind regime and associated wave regime in the northern Gulf of Mexico. And given the time of year that this happened, many physical oceanographers who study the northern Gulf could say with quite confidence that the primary impact was going to be confined to Alabama westward, possibly the western part of the Florida Panhandle, probably not going east of Panama City, and certainly not at Apalachicola, just based on the knowledge we had there. We also did a study as hurricane season approached. Actually, I had the opportunity to brief some congressmen at the time about this, who represented the Florida district, and we were able to convince them that a hurricane or a tropical storm would actually be favorable to the Florida coast, devastating perhaps to some of the marsh areas around Louisiana and Alabama. Of course, congressmen are out there, areas they represent. And yeah, that is pretty much what happened. What I didn't expect is that the amount of surface oil that was observable after that storm would decrease strikingly for some time period. So based on just knowledge of the season in which it happened and what the climate period, the annual cycle, or if you will, the climatology of winds in the region, I think the expectation was what the result was. Heavy impacts in Alabama, Mississippi, and eastern Louisiana.
But I'm going to get back to your question. Because you asked, at the time, did we know? And so if we look at the collective consciousness of everybody in the country, some people knew, but obviously wasn't propagated all the way through.
Right.
So there's a lot of pieces in between the understanding that an expert has, all the way through that information that finally gets to you. So it's a case kind of the left hand, the right hand, not knowing what each other is doing, what's going on. And so if we were to ask, okay, today, would we know what would happen? Still, the experts would know, but would you get the right information still? And I worry the answer is no.
So if I can follow up something I've been thinking about, which may be appropriate for later, is I'd like to hear from people out there. What is it that scientists could put out that would be used? We've heard about forecasting tools, but is there a study? Is there something more easily digestible? Of course, something we think about is of course, scenarios. Stuff's out there in the literature. It was out in the literature well before 2010. I have a paper that had a few, as scientists we always care about how many citations our papers have. I had a paper that was getting a few off and on. I wrote back maybe in 2003 or something like that. After 2010, it's gotten hundreds. So it was out there. It just wasn't being, nobody knew about it, I guess, before this happened. What can we put out that people would know about? Are there, is there a study that can produce some sort of maps, seasonal scenarios? I mean, we always think scenarios is probably the way to go. And then the other question is, I have is, as a scientist, when another scientist refers to our work, uses our work, we know about it because we get citation and we can find that in Google. Google Scholar tells us right away. But if a responder or an agency uses it and it doesn't result in a citation, we don't know. And unless somebody calls us and tells us or we find out about word of mouth. Is there a way that we can find out what is being useful and what is not? Just like we can find out when we write a paper how useful it is within the scientific community based on its citations. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that?
We are going to hold that for this afternoon. Hopefully you're sticking around for this afternoon because at 2:15, that's what our discussion is all about. So I'll jot those down and we can, bring those back up when we have that discussion because that's what we really want to do during that session is tease out things like that and see how Sea Grant can help, how other agencies can help. So that's, everyone, keep that in mind. Okay, did you have a question, Jackie?
Jackie Michelle with RPI NOAA. One thing that I think that drove a lot of the crises and what people were worried about was that we never knew when the release was going to be stopped. So people did a lot of things because the Ishak grew out for 180 days before they were able to cap it. So it's a different, and that was shallower water and everything else, and so all your worst case scenarios were just off the chart. But I think that just, as part of the response, James, we know about, we've had a really good modeling group and people reach out, but there are mixed messages. So I guess when somebody shows it going all the way to England, and the NOAA model shows it just going where it went. And I think one thing that some of the local scientists can provide, perhaps that filter, hopefully you're known and more trusted in your community, and you can reach out to the news, and we can have reliable sources that says, oh, these people, did the England trajectory, but they're way off, and I'm an expert in this area, and I can feel with confidence that this is likely that the scenarios are different than those other versions that everybody likes on the news to hear the worst case. Right? So is there a role for you to play in terms of being that trusted local voice?
Well, as an example, I ended up doing about a 20-minute on-air segment with the local Fox radio affiliate in Tallahassee for the early morning, very popular early morning drive-in program. Happened to do it from my comfort of my bed, actually. And that was an opportunity for me to dispel some of the rumblings and rumors and concerns out there about the worst case scenario. I know a lot of people heard it because I heard from a lot of people. And that was to a particular segment that often scientists don't reach to, given the nature of the network. But they reached out to me through the university, and we don't typically go the other direction.
Personally, I would not want to put a researcher in that position. There's researchers in Italy, geophysical researchers who are in jail now because they gave the wrong advice on earthquake prediction. There should be an official channel of some group that's responsible for getting the right information out and getting that information out in a coordinated way. So the researchers certainly should be connecting to those people, giving them advice, and they should be reaching out to the research community, asking what the right thing to do is to be prepared for the future. But asking researchers to stand up and give official guidance is starting to get dangerous for the public and the researchers themselves. You can do that sometime.
Yeah, well, of course, it has to be opinion. The university actually puts out, it's the difference between working in the federal government and working for the university. The university wants media relations. They have whole departments about it, and they connect them to us. But again, it's got to be, we're asked. And I have to say, too, that you better be careful because even in a program like that, they try to ask gotcha type questions. And a lot of the gotcha type questions will, be political motivations. And it's difficult to be prepared for those. So it's a role I think a lot of researchers don't relish.
And I think what we'll do, I'm over here now, guys. You started finding me, I'm all over the place. And so that's another thing this afternoon, we're going to be talking about like challenges, and that's a really good one. Another one that came up when we had the wetland seminar was funding. If you have funding to work on one thing, and so we'll talk about that a little bit more. Did you have a question?
This is getting back to a question a little bit ago about like ocean springs, especially coastal Mississippi, waiting for the impact. I'm Tyler Merwin. I'm the oil spill emergency response coordinator at the Chevron Pascagoula refinery, so very local in that same area. And it just comes down, I think, a lot to the modeling. We said we know what gaps there are in modeling of the Gulf. That's such a huge body of water, so much complexity, especially as you start to get around the different coastlines. And the Mississippi Sound is no different, and there's really just no data. There hasn't been any funding to figure out for mapping purposes and trajectory purposes. I run into this all the time because every year I have to make up a spill or something like that to exercise my teams. So I pay people that have us modeling software. But I know when I get it from them, a lot of times just the base model is like, oh, oil would never do that. So you have to take that local knowledge and then kind of make it real. And I think that's the whole idea, is no one out there really has that data and really good modeling, especially on the near shore, when you have a lot of complex shoreline, to tell where the oil, how the impact is going to be.
Okay, we have 15 minutes, as you guys can hear and maybe smell, lunch is here. So, are there any other questions in here? No? Tara, any questions online that are related to this panel? Okay, we did have one question, which we're going to save for afternoon because it was very heavily related to response, and you guys have response experience, but we'll save that for the afternoon. Okay, so 14 minutes, 2 minutes each. Tell us what you guys are planning on studying in the future. What can we look for? Look, Frank, that's what happens when you're on the edge.
Thank you. Thanks for that. So the one thing, and you mentioned funding, so the one thing I got a lot of questions when the oil spill was, everyone wants to know what's going to happen. So from a biological perspective, it's a lot of different scale from the physical. We didn't know, and a lot of that is because compared to regions like the Great Lakes and Chesapeake Bay that were funded, well funded, arguably for years, the Gulf of Mexico, for as much as it produces in fisheries, oil and gas resources, commercial enterprises, we knew very little about it, relatively speaking. And then I think one thing I hope we educated the public and particularly news media, because that kind of drives me crazy too, is the pace of some of the science. So we go out and collect plankton samples, and I have a small army of interns and grad students who are picking through these things under a microscope, trying to pull out the fish eggs and the fish larvae, and then a reporter comes 3 months later and says, "What'd you find out?" it's like, we're not close to being done with the stuff we've collected. I mean, and so then the 1-year anniversary came about, and we were dreading it because we knew, we had gotten X number, and there's no way I'm gonna go out on these gotcha questions and make some prediction about a certain fishery or some characteristic of the environment. I mean, we have this peer review process, and our peers look at our science, and we debate it, and in talking about the different models, we don't always have a consensus of opinion. And so I think it is sort of what I would like to see. Hopefully going forward, there is some understanding that now that we have been funded, we should know a lot more about what should happen, perhaps, or what may happen. But at that time, we didn't. And so maybe the pace of the science, maybe we have enough baseline data, if you will. But what I would like to see personally, getting back to the original thing, is that I go to the GOMRI meetings, go Moses, these other conferences, and you see plenary speakers, and to a person, they talk about baseline data and how important baseline data is and what we need to know about the system. No one's funding it. I mean, there's very few agencies or of all these groups that are going to fund what we would consider classic monitoring of environmental conditions and other things, at least from a biological perspective. And so we all agree it's important. I think now we need to support it, and then we have some idea of what the system, I mentioned the noise earlier. We know what the noise is. Now can we pick out some kind of perturbation of what that did to that system?
All right, 2 minutes. So we now know that the oil-soluble oxygenated species are produced only from photooxidation. Bio-oxidation contributes nothing to that carbon pool. We also know that the water-soluble carbon for photooxidation is 50 times higher than bio-oxidation. We now know that the photooxidation, since it's the only thing that produces oil-soluble OX, is responsible and solely responsible for the oil's contribution to forming a mousse or an interface. We can now, because we also do petroleum research, we now know how to isolate that interfacial material, and we can provide it to chemical service companies, because the oil that they're trying to spray surfactants on is not the oil that came out of the well. It's heavily modified. And so the idea is that you could have surfactant packages for surface oil versus at depth injection, and the toxicity of the water solubles produced by photoox is higher than the oil itself. But it only occurs in a 6-day window. And so we can't understand why. And so we have a sneaking suspicion that that interfacial layer that forms from the photoox is actually dictating what can pass from the oil to the water. And that's very important, because if you spray surfactants on something that's been heavily photooxed, you're going to pulse all that toxic material into the environment very quickly. So we're trying to understand that and deliver knowledge in that field.
Well, I'm 100% soft money on the scientist, so for the next few years I work on probably about 6 or 7 things unrelated to what we're talking about today. But I will be spending a significant amount of portion of my time serving as scientific director for a newly GOMRI-funded consortium. And what we'll be doing is focusing on taking a lot of recent observations, theoretical work, and models, and putting them together into a tool. So working with microbiologists who have been modeling the microbial in the Gulf of Mexico, biogeochemists, sediment people, oil spill experts, and physical circulation modeling. And combining all the modeling tools that people have been developing independently, if you will, since the BP spill, using new results, and putting them together in a tool so we can start to understand and simulate the processes of how things interact, how sediment can actually transport oil and microbes, from suspended sediments down to the benthos. Once we develop this tool, it can be used now for running scenarios. I mentioned some before. What if the oil spill had happened in the dead of winter? What if the spill had happened in such a region where it directly impacted the hypoxic region? And this will be the end product of the next couple years of research, which then hopefully can be used by the wider community.
how long have people been predicting the weather of the atmosphere? And the first predictions were around 1930s, very simple ones. 1950s, when people developed computers, they got a lot more complex. 1970s, when there were finally satellites, people could do a reasonable job of a couple-day forecast. Now it's a few-day forecast, 5-day forecast. Ocean prediction operation, we really started around 2000. And if we look at what we were able to do in 2010 relative to now, what we were able to do in 2010 is rather laughable. We look at the results back then and say, oh, that's a nice toy. When we look at the future, several years from now, with new computers, with satellites, all the new understanding, what we can do, it'll be the difference between what we can do now would be a dark room versus walking into a dark room and turning on a light. We'll be able to see what's really going on in the ocean with a much higher degree of accuracy than what we can do now.
So over the next 2 years, what I hope to be doing relevant to oil spill work is expanding the high-frequency radar system in the Gulf of Mexico. And so right now we have, Texas has a system, University of South Florida has a system off the West Florida shelf. And we operate one from Pascagoula over to Destin, Florida, which covers most of the Mississippi Bayou from the Mississippi River Delta over to Cape San Blas. And so we're hopefully we'll be putting news stations at the mouth of the Mississippi River and over to Port Fourchon so that we can cover that whole coast from Port Fourchon over to Destin out to about 200 kilometers offshore. And so that would be, it would cover a good portion of the area where all the oil and gas platforms are. There will still be a big gap between Port Fourchon and Texas, but it would be a good start in filling that gap.
Well, as a postdoc, I don't really have a long look ahead for my future research, but I personally am interested in learning more about how river water goes out into the shelf, because from these model predictions, generally, like that gentleman in the back was mentioning, we don't really know what's going on in the coast and inside the sounds and everything, because it's relatively understudied. And so to have those predictions in the model, we really need to have some sort of background to understand. So for my side of things, I want to understand how those river plumes are moved around by the winds and the tides and the waves, especially in the very interesting and complex environment in the Gulf of Mexico, where you have all these barrier islands and huge river discharges from the Mississippi River and Mobile Bay and a bunch of other little rivers in between, and then how all of that can help us improve our predictions of these regions in the future.
In the next 2 years or so, we'll try to understand how long it takes for these very dark layers that you see there to turn into dirt. And that relates a little bit to the questions that were asked here before. How long do we expect that people, the public, can wait for oil to degrade, and what are people mostly interested in? And we think, of course, one major interest is this toxic? Is this harmful to me? How long is it harmful? And scientists certainly can provide that information. If we look at the degradation of oil, we have crude oil here as it comes out of the reservoir, and on the other side of the spectrum you have basically dirt. And what happens is that in this continuum you get a continuous, as Ryan pointed out, initially due to all the degradation processes you get an enormous increase in the components that you can find in this oil due to oxidation processes and other processes that divide oil in different substances. and then all these substances will go the degradation path. But there is no clear gap in there somewhere, but we can certainly say we have an initial phase where especially this light Louisiana crude oil that we have here is very toxic because all the volatiles are in there. They can easily penetrate through our lungs, through our skin and so forth. And those volatiles will be gone relatively quickly as the oil sits on the surface, especially when it sits on a hot surface. So we can provide that information and say, okay, stay off the beach for the first week at least as the oil came to shore, and we will tell you that you can prevent a lot of damage. And then we will have to decide, and that will be based on what Ryan and his colleagues find out, at what times these components are down to concentrations that we can say, okay, this is something that we can tolerate. Because the oil and the oil components will not vanish. It's not that, even if we don't see them, these oxidized products will be still in the sediment to some concentration. And it takes for a very long time to disappear, but that will never happen because there's always replenishment also. So we have to agree on some level that we can tolerate.
Perfect timing. Perfect. Okay, so let's give a round of applause to all of our panelists.